broadcasting from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Welcome to The Gaily Show, the only daily LGBTQ radio news and talk show in the United States. I am your host, John Parker. Also streaming on our YouTube channel right now. If you like what we're doing, subscribe, click that like button, and leave us a comment. Okay, I want to acknowledge there's a lot happening in the news today, and coming up after us, we have the best in progressive news and talk with the Matt McNeil Show in Minneapolis, Democracy Now! In Chicago. This is our time of the week, though, where we step back from the headlines and we have a weekly episode that I call Unpack This For Me, where we bring in expert guests to unpack a particular issue facing the LGBTQ and allied community. And today, here is what our guests are going to unpack for me. Folks on YouTube can see me holding it up. It is the new book, A Black Queer History of the United States. It comes out on January 20th. My guests today are the authors of the book. Dr. C. Riley Snorton is a professor of English language and comparative literature and is core faculty at the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender at Columbia University. He is the author of the award-winning book, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity. Also, Dr. Darius Bost is an associate professor of Black Studies and of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Bost is the author of the award-winning book, Evidence of Being, The Black Gay Cultural Renaissance and the Politics of Violence. Riley and Darius, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thanks so much for having us.
All right. Can we start with Marlon Riggs's 1994 film, Black Is... Black Ain't, A Personal Journey Through Black Identity? Because right away in the introduction, you unpack this film and how it relates and informs and guides your book. So who would like to start by telling us, like, what is this film and how did it sort of inspire the book that you wrote for us? Riley, you want to?
I mean, I'm happy to get started. So, as we were co-authoring this book, like many academic texts, the introduction actually comes a little later. And, Darius and I were thinking about the impact of Marlon Riggs as a filmmaker, as important Black gay voice, and spent some time watching his documentaries together as we were kind of trying to brainstorm what shape the introduction would take. And so as we were looking at the film Black Is, Black Ain't, it became so crystal clear that what Riggs was doing in that film in terms of unpacking race and its relationship to sexuality and gender and region and nation was so in alignment with what we were up to in our project. And we thought it'd be an amazing way to kind of open the book. I mean, one of the things that, Riggs suggests, right, is that Blackness has many meanings. And it also, it has been defined in ways that has to be redefined or has to be rejected and redefined. And so that felt like a really generative starting point.
Darius, would like to add to that, or I don't want to be...
Yeah, I mean, I think upon watching it again, I think we were both saw the moment where he was talking about what it meant to not only reflect on what Black is, but what it was to be able to understand what it is in the present moment. And so that also was an entryway into thinking about the past, jumping off from the work that he had done. What did sort of piggyback off what Riley said, what sort of histories sort of allowed us to think about the expansiveness of Blackness, and what also were the histories of stigma and rejection that we had to grapple with in order to write this kind of history.
Mm-hmm. As part of that, and if I may read part of the introduction, you both wrote, one way to think of Blackness is in an expansive way is to play with naming, whether Black is a last name, a drag name, or a reference to icon status. Playing with names allows us to speculate about what Black is, was, will be, and ain't. And then you introduce us to Phil Black, Georgia Black, Joan Jett Black, and Angela Davis. And would you be willing to share a little bit about each of them? Because it's such amazing stories, iconic for all four of them, really. And I think I'd like to be able to share those with our audience members, some of whom I'm sure, like Joan Jett Black and Angela Davis, they may know, and maybe less so Phil Black and Georgia Black. So maybe we could start with Phil, and you can share part of Phil's life story and fits where his story fits in the narrative that you're trying to tell in your book.
Yes, well, Phil Black starts out as a performer in the early 20th century in Pittsburgh, develops a really strong reputation as a female impersonator. After developing that reputation, moves to New York City and becomes well known for running a drag ball in Harlem, New York. And one of the things that we were interested in is that this was a moment where we can highlight the kinds of regulations, particularly around homosexuality in Harlem, both being a permissive space, but also one in which, you get one of the first anti-gay sermons by Adam Clayton Powell Sr., as well as Vice reports. And part of what we wanted to think about was the way that Phil Black, in leading, as a leader in the drag ball scene, was a part of a kind of resistance to the sort of a regulation within Black communities, and also the regulation that was coming from outside the Black communities around race. And thinking about the way that Phil Black, as a performer, was a part of a resistance to a kind of mainstream approach to civil rights that did not consider sort of possibilities of gender and sexuality outside of marriage and family and heteronormativity. And so, we found him to be a really important figure, both as a sort of historic leader of the resistance movement, but also as an amazing performer that we wanted to highlight.
I'm talking with Dr. C. Riley Snorton and Dr. Darius Bost, authors of the upcoming book, A Black Queer History of the United States, which will be in bookstores on January 20th. I don't suppose there are any... Are there like stills, like photos of Phil in performance?
Yeah, we found a sort of small book, and I forget the name of it, but it's a book that collects these sort of stories of female impersonators and drag performers, and there are several pictures of Phil Black in costume. So the book is not readily available, but there are online sources where you can find it.
Mm-hmm. And this is previewing a question that I want to ask later, because you both grapple with the idea of the archive and writing fiction to make up the gaps for the archive. So but I'm previewing upcoming questions here. Can we turn to Georgia Black, community pillar in Sanford, Florida? Maybe Riley, you can share about Georgia and where she fits in the narrative you're telling.
Yeah, so we know about Georgia Black in part because of the news stories that emerged around her death in the late 1920s in Sanford, Florida. She is a very early, in some sense, record of Black trans femininity in the South. One of the pieces of her story that I always hold on to and linger with has to do with just the degree to which, even as the articles that are coming out about her are trying to disparage her, trying to make her seem like she's an oddity of some sort, they can't help but also tell the story that's happening on the ground, which is how deeply loved she is, how loved she is in her by her family members, by her church community, even by her employers. And, Sanford, Florida, I like to think of it as now having a double reputation. On one hand, it's known as the place that excluded Jackie Robinson from playing baseball. And on the other hand, as the kind of initial news in the Black press relate, it was also a moment of full integration at the scene of her funeral, because all these people came together to memorialize her life. Georgia Black, she was married twice. She had a son. Her son, in fact, who comes later in the story after the initial round of news reports to further clarify just how beloved she was, and how, kind of common trope in the news at that time that actually persists is this idea that trans people, once we know that they're trans, are somehow up to something criminal. And so her son is especially out to set the record straight, that she wasn't up to some sort of illicit work necessarily, but rather was living the life according to how she experienced herself, and how she understood herself, and how she also was understood in community. So that felt like a really important story for us to tell, that once again explains that transness is not a new phenomena. Obviously, at the end of the late 1920s precedes the Christine Jorgensen story. And so that's always been a kind of key aspect to thinking about trans history as one that includes, Black trans historical figures and ancestors as well.
Both Phil Black and Georgia Black are fantastic stories, folks. I'm holding up the book cover. I'm coming up on a break here. For folks on YouTube, you can see the book cover there, and it is it is not just, as what they say on the promotional material, a landmark study on Black queer history, which congratulations, by the way. But it is such a it is a great read, and I say that sometimes because people are like, "Oh, it's an academic book, it's a history book, it's going to be like hard to get through." And I'm like, "No, this is a good one, folks." And we've got links in our show notes and on our websites for you to pre-order your book now, so that you can have it on January 20th. We're going to have more with Riley and Darius when we come back after this very quick break. You're listening to The Gailey Show on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I am John Parker. We are coming up on the bottom of the hour. This is our weekly episode we like to call Unpack This For Me, where we sit down with expert guests to take a deep dive into issues facing the LGBTQ and allied community. A new landmark book tracing the lives of LGBTQ plus Black Americans from slavery to the present day is coming out on January 20th. It is called A Black Queer History of the United States. My guests today are its authors, Dr. C. Riley Snorton and Dr. Darius Bost. Can we turn to Joan Jett Black? I mean, where do we begin with Joan? But can you share the story that you tell of her life? Particularly, you focus on her presidential campaigns in the late 80s, early 90s. Darius, you want to pick us up there?
Where do I want to start? Well, how about, I guess one of the things that I think is really interesting about Joan Jett Black is the fact that this campaign by a drag performer is one that we might not think is a serious one that only resides in the place of performance, but it is one that we should take seriously because of the way that Black from this space sort of shows us how queer performers are their voices are marginalized in larger American society. So I think including that story, including one that we might just think is outrageous and one that is not serious, is one that we should take seriously. I don't know if you want to add
No, I
to
mean,
that.
I think absolutely. And I think also, Joan Jett Black, we might remember that kind of iconic image where she's borrowing from Black Power, Black Panther imagery with her guns in hand. And I think that there's something about that image that also underscores just the political power of her humor, the way that she's able to inhabit certain forms of iconic imagery in order to make a bigger point. And so, the fact that Joan Jett Black ran against a whole bunch of political candidates who were certainly heteronormative, if not homophobic, with slogans like "Lick Bush," kind of underscores the well, I don't want to necessarily quote RuPaul on this, but I think we can think about the acronym there. But to think about the great verve, of a person like Joan Jett Black, who was really making it happen in ways that included kind of just storming the Democratic National Convention floor, or having her announcement of her political platform at a local a kind of surrounding gay club in New York City during that time. So, there's something about her DIY, and yet also that she voiced what she would say as the voice of the others in a two-party system where neither party at the time was particularly interested in thinking about LGBT rights.
Yeah. And I think in a moment where drag is seen as commercialized and so apolitical, I think it's important to turn to figures and, as someone who is a contemporary of RuPaul and all the sort of things surrounding drag race and the way that, we have a RuPaul Drag Race experience here in Chicago. And so, again, turning back to a figure, as Marley said, whose humor is political, but also sort of has brought voices from the margin to the center of the political stage and reimagining political theater as we know it.
Could you... we're grappling with today, particularly on the sort of whatever we want to call the left here, of what is the broad agenda that we should be coalescing around. Could you remind us of Joan Jett Black's platform? Because it was pretty comprehensive, and I think there's things that we can learn. It wasn't just what you're both saying, that it wasn't just political theater. There was some what's the right word here? There was some meat on the bones. I don't know if that's the right metaphor here for the platform that she was campaigning on.
Yeah, no, I mean, she was absolutely thinking about what we would consider structural change, right? Like she was interested in thinking about and putting forward a sense of a kind of social safety net, and thought that, we needed to attack kind of broad issues around housing, healthcare, et cetera. So all of the things that we would think, a serious political candidate would be talking about. But I also want to highlight that, beauty was incredibly important to her platform. She was like, I campaign for beauty. And when she said that, she would further elaborate that, by which she meant, like, what would it mean for people to be kind, decent, and regard each other with care and respect? And that was not only does that kind of resonate as an incredible political message for us right now, but I also think, I just have so much admiration for her insistence that that's also a part of a platform that would include other, let's say, more standard fare for what we would expect to ask or hear from our political candidates about.
Absolutely. It's always so fascinating to me when just getting into all of those, both because there was the That was the 88 campaign, and then there was the Lick Slick Willie, which was 92, right? There was that campaign as well. So there was the two, and really getting into that is just, it's very instructive politics, folks.
Yeah.
To look up, and there was just the fundraiser for her. I think it's closed now. I think it ended on January 4th. But stay tuned to our news partner, Windy City Times, for ways that folks can continue to support Joan. I have 90 seconds. Maybe that's too soon. The fourth person is Angela Davis, and there's so much to talk about related to Angela Davis, and I don't necessarily want to start that with less than a minute to go here before we get started. So what I will say, as we go into this very quick break that we're coming up here on, if you like what we're doing here at the Gailey Show, check out our YouTube channel, because we archive all of these weekly conversations we have in our Unpack This For Me, where we really dive into really serious issues with verve and intelligence and wisdom from our guests. And so we have a whole playlist of these conversations there for you to check out, where you can watch anytime at your convenience. The book that we're talking about today is A Black Queer History of the United States. It comes out on January 20th. We have links in our show notes and on our website. If you go to our website, just look for today's date, January 8th, and you can find the links for that. We're going to have more with its authors, Dr. C. Riley Snorton and Dr. Darius Bost, when we come back. You're listening to The Gailey Show on AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Broadcasting from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I am John Parker. It is 33 minutes after the hour. This is our weekly Unpack This For Me episode, where we sit down with expert guests to talk about issues facing the LGBTQ and allied community. Today, we are unpacking the new book, A Black Queer History of the United States. It comes out on January 20th. My guests today are its authors. Dr. C. Riley Snorton is a professor of English language and comparative literature and is core faculty at the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender at Columbia University. He is the author of the award-winning book, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity. Dr. Darius Bost is an associate professor of Black Studies and of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Hey, Chicago. Dr. Bost is the author of the award-winning book, Evidence of Being, the Black Gay Cultural Renaissance and the Politics of Violence. The fourth person then in your introduction that is part of this idea of understanding Black identity, the expansiveness of it, is Angela Davis. So who would like to begin by sharing, why did you want to look at Angela Davis specifically, and how it helped talking about her to the book that you're writing?
I think one thing that sort of sparked our interest is, like, Angela Davis is in the film, and we in Black is Black Ain't, and we consider Davis as, one of the sort of foremost theorists and activists in the Black community. And I don't think people know that she's a lesbian. And I think it's, rather, and I think that was part of what Riggs is trying to do, right, is to sort of think about the ways that we, only consider race and not gender and sexuality. Oftentimes, folks are accused of pushing the LGBTQ agenda and do not see some of the things that Angela Davis has been a proponent of is connected to that. By that time, Davis is out as a lesbian, has done keynote speaking at a lesbian conference, and yet we don't think about how queerness and labeling her perhaps as a Black queer feminist expands the sort of political platform and the sort of thinking that she does to things like the prison, to anti-colonial activism to her connection to civil rights, all of these things we can claim as part of the LGBTQ agenda.
I love that. Yes. I mean, I think too, the watching the film in the early 2020s, Angela Davis is so iconic. And the film, includes her contemporaries like Bell Hooks and Barbara Smith. But it also includes, family members of Riggs and folks who live in New Orleans, and where a number of scenes are set. And so I think that there's something also about spending time with Angela Davis as an icon, who is a queer person, and who also, I think in the space between the film's initial circulation, and now has also really deeply talked about how sexuality informs her politics. And so, I think so much about how Angela Davis and others talk about their relationship to queer and trans liberation movements as really informing their understanding of abolition and prison abolition. And so that felt like an important node to kind of touch down on before we jump into a book that is going to go back to the earliest form, colonial America, and kind of go into a kind of speculation about what the future might look like. And so for a project so sweeping, I think the four people represent a lot, but I think it also kind of names a limit. What does it mean to try to work on the first Black queer history? It's to know that this is a project that cannot be exhaustive. And so we also, kind of thought about this project as an invitation for people to think about the histories that they would add, the names that they would add. But that these four names, we thought could serve as a loose roadmap for what's ahead.
Yeah. And just one quick addition is, the moment where Davis talks about doing the work on Blues women helped to introduce gender and sexuality into their politics. And so we hope in that way that folks might read this book and see how important gender and sexuality is to Black politics as well.
Okay, that was just the introduction, folks. So now let's turn to chapter 1, where you do take us all the way back to colonial America, the transatlantic slave trade. You're walking us through the construction of white and Black identity, which is a lesson that we need to be, for some folks, learning for the first time, and for others, relearning in this particular moment, historical moment we're living through right now. But also you grapple with, in the book, the idea of the archive, and how do we find historical sources and information when so much of it was deliberately marginalized, gotten rid of, destroyed, right, etc. Can you walk us through then that first chapter and what you're exploring there in terms of identity construction, but also teasing out and inferring queer life experiences in it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think working on a history that begins in colonial America has a lot of, let's start with big question marks. One, there's a question about the language and terminology itself. And so how are you kind of thinking about queer life, trans life, possibly in this period? That's a question mark that chapter had to figure out how to address. The second is okay, so then what are your sources? What are you building from? And so you've mentioned the kind of books, steady eye on the nature of the archives that are being used. And I think particularly in, colonial and early America, so many of those archives are archives in many ways of racial violence and sexual terror. They would look like a ledger. They would look like the diaries of enslavers. And so, they would also look like the narratives of fugitive enslaved people, or people who fled from enslavement. And so there is a reading practice that's required there to be able to kind of foreground what the kind of dynamics of sexuality are in any particular given scene. Harriet Jacobs is someone that that the chapter touches down with at numerous moments, because she includes a number of scenes of contact between enslavers and the enslaved that really seem to pivot on questions of sexuality, and the way that sexual dominance was part of an economy on the plantation. But the other kind of key aspect of that first chapter for us was to really ask a philosophical and political question that was about, can we even imagine what pleasurable erotic contact might look like in this period? And for that question, we turn to queer authors who are writing historical fiction. And that felt like a way to respond to a question where the archives, the official archives, felt too limited to answer the question that we wanted to address. And so we spent time with the Gilda stories, Jewel Gomez's work. We also, Robert Jones Jr.'s The Prophets, as just two examples where it's focused on enslaved queer protagonists. And we take those narratives as a way to enrich a story that has been limited, or to kind of further the metaphor, impoverished by the various kinds of forms of marginalization from archives, but also, there's a question about who people think are worthy of having their stories documented. And so when we think about what constitutes the archive, that is also structured by these forms of anti-Black plantocratic logic. And so it was a very complicated chapter to try to do. And I think that in some ways, this is also why our book is both chronological and thematic, because there are questions that chapter opens that we revisit at various moments in the text. And I think that also, in some way, we can talk about the archive, we can talk about power, we can also just talk about how people experience time. And sometimes, the concerns of a given time recur in another moment. And that's something that we also wanted to address when there was more opportunity to have Black queer historical figures speak on their own terms.
My guests today are Dr. C. Riley Snorton and Dr. Darius Bost, authors of the upcoming book, A Black Queer History of the United States, which will be in bookstores on January 20th. I'm sorry, Darius, did I just interrupt you?
No, the small point that I wanted to add, and it's not necessarily about the archive, but it is in a certain way, because, part of, why it's important to look at this history as a kind of foundation for the work that we're doing is that, one could argue that part of the kinds of heteronormativity and gender normativity that Black communities have invested in comes from this history of not wanting to sort of hark back to Blackness as being associated with sexual depravity. And so in order to sort of address that throughout, we have to sort of tackle that sort of historical narrative that continues to be projected onto queer and trans bodies. And that continues to throughout the 19th and 20th century as we try to lay out. And I think it's also in terms of thinking about our expansive understanding of Blackness, right? The unspeakable nature of acts in these slave narratives are oftentimes thought about as the kind of traumatic narratives, but unspeakability can also be about these kinds of same-sex modes of eroticism. And I think that is what literature, looking at literature, allows us to uncover, for lack of a better term.
I love that. And I don't mean to, I wanted to, there's so much in your book. And so I feel like I'm bookending it right now. We're going to do the introduction, then we're going to do the first chapter, and then we're going to skip ahead all the way toward back to the 21st century, which is skipping over a huge part of the book. But hopefully what this is doing is encouraging people to definitely be heading to our website and to our show notes to be ordering their copy right now. My next question, and again, we've got about a minute here, so maybe I can preview it and then we can pick it up after the break, is, I want to be mindful here that, this is apples and oranges, but as an Armenian American, and my Armenian family were survivors of the genocide. And so there's a lot of, in that community, narratives around where you can't choose to be queer. This is going to be the end of the Armenian race. If you do that, you're basically just perpetrating the genocide, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the other side, it's like, well, this queer stuff isn't just Western. You know what I mean? There's this tradition of queerness within Armenian, history. And you explore the intersectionality of that. Again, apples and oranges. So I want to be mindful that I'm not, comparing the two. But I want to pick that up when we come back after the break, because I think it's also very instructive to where we're at in this moment in America. So we're going to have more with Dr. C. Riley Snorton and Dr. Darius Bost when we come back, authors of A Black Queer History of the United States. Welcome back to the Gailey Show. We are coming up on the top of the hour. I am John Parker. I'm here with the authors of A Black Queer History of the United States, Dr. C. Riley Snorton and Dr. Darius Bost. Before the break, I was personal life story, but you cover at the end of the book, as you're sort of getting us here into the 21st century, looking towards the future, the limitations that the LGBTQ rights movement has had for intersectionality, and also some limitations that the you both will characterize this better than I have, the civil rights movement had in terms as it related to folks like Angela Davis, folks not even knowing that she was, identified as lesbian. How many folks didn't know that Bayard Rustin identified as gay until the movie came out 5 years ago, right? So can you talk to us about that lack of intersectionality, the challenges that are there? There is this idea that comes up towards the end of the books of the limitations and even maybe the futility of legislative reforms, and what we can really get through that. Like, what quality can we get? What equity could we get through that? So I don't know who wants to pick it up there. Darius or Riley? It's a huge prompt to suddenly jump off of.
It is a huge prompt. I mean, I think, just to sort of introduce part of what you're talking about in terms of the limitation of rights, part of what we talk about is the emphasis on sort of mainstream LGBT rights organizations on hate crimes and marriage laws. And one of the things that we discuss is that, even though these things may not appear to be racially inflected, they are, given the sort of ways that Loving v. Virginia over interracial marriage was the sort of main precedent that was used in marriage law. Thinking about how in hate crimes law, that sort of we can't think about that without thinking about mass incarceration that is impacting African Americans, many communities of color, and the use of carceral solutions in hate crimes has an effect on sort of reproduces, right, those forms of racial domination. And so, we struggled, I think, well, I brought it up more so than Riley, about what it meant for us to have a critique of rights in this moment where it seems like our rights are being taken away. But I think concluded that it's still, we have to have a kind of intersectional resistance, a broad political platform, if we are going to not just address the sort of immediate sort of legal issues when, homophobia, racism, sexism are all already embedded within the law, right? And law enforcement. And so, we champion, the idea of an intersectional form of resistance that can tackle the kinds of systemic forms of oppression that will continue to impact Black queer communities because they are not being addressed by the law.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Darius said is just so on point. And the one small thing I'll say is that, part of this critique of rights also has to do with, that people's sense of personhood can't be structured by the law or by government. And so it makes me think a lot about when Black on Both Sides came out. It was during the first term of our current administration. And so it was at the time where there were news headlines that said, trans people being written out of existence. And I was like, well, that can't happen, even with the kind of legal prohibitions, and they continue and proliferate, that, existence is quite different from the matter of legal personhood. And to collapse those two things is not only a political problem, but it's a well-being problem. It's a problem of self-identification and collective activation, or collective, the kind of possibility of what it means to live collectively. So, that was a kind of a note that feels both like perhaps slightly discordant for some in this current moment, when what we're getting is a lot more criminalization and prohibition. But I think at the same time, there's something about all of those decades that we moved through before we get there too, that's about like where moments felt more possible and less possible. And we continue to live in that spiral. And I think it's important to, I think the book is making a point that it's important to evaluate what seems like the available tool or the convenient tool in a given moment. And to be students of history, and to kind of think about what other reverberations a particular political path might have, even if it feels like a good one to pursue at that time. So, I think being students of history is also to be to have more tools and armor available to you in a present that feels, for many of us, pretty bad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Really bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that next week we've got I talk a lot about the Supreme Court on here, and I get in a lot of history about that institution. We have the case before them next Tuesday, and for folks that are like, wait a minute, rights can be taken away, and I'm like, okay, yeah, we need to talk about the Supreme Court, folks. That's a case in point right there, checkmate. I can't believe how fast this went. Riley, Darius, thank you for joining me here today. The book is A Black Queer History of the United States. It is available January 20th, but you can pre-order it now by going to our website and checking out our show notes on YouTube if you are there. I see that on Instagram, Riley, you are at c.RileySnorton. Darius, is there a social media that folks can connect with you on?
What is my social media?
Okay,
Windy City BQ. Windy City BQ, one word.
Perfect. Well, thank you again both very much. Up next on AM 950 Radio is the Matt McNeil Show. On WCPT 820, it is Democracy Now! And until this time tomorrow, keep it queer, America.
Thanks so much.